Let's create our first model, and that's gonna be for the employee. So I'm going to right click models, add a class, and I'll call this one employee. Now we have an existing database, so we need to map this class to the table in that database. Let's have a look at it again. So let's open our database, Northwind over here, open the tables, and we want the table for the employees. So I'm gonna right click that and view data. And you can see, like I said before, that there are quite a few fields in this table that represents the employee. Now we are not gonna be using all of them. So we are going to be using the ID of the employee, of course. We'll use the first name and last name. We can use the title, which is the job title of the employee. We can work with some dates, so I will also use the birth date as well as the hire date. We can use the country because that will serve us well to display how select list works in the views. And then I will also, let's say, add the notes. So just a little note for each of the employees. So let's go back to our employee model. And let's start coding this. First of all, I'm going to designate this employee class to be mapped to the table of employees in our database. So I'll use an attribute called table. And I will specify that this is for the table employees. Now table is underlined because we need to bring in the namespace, which is the component model.dataAnnotations.schema. And now we can start creating properties for some of the fields that we want to use. So first we need the ID of the employee. So this is going to be a property of integer. I'll call it employee ID. The next one is the first name. So this is going to be a property of string, and I'll call it first name. And then we'll have the last name, of course. Again, that's going to be a string. Then we'll have the job title. So this is going to be another property of string. I'll call it title. And then we'll have the birth date. So this is going to be a property of date time. And I'll call this one birth date. Then we'll have the hire date. So the two will be date time. I'll call this one hire date. And then we'll have the employee's country. So this is going to be a property of string, and I'll call it country. And finally, we'll have those notes. So that's again going to be a string. I'll call this one notes. Now, I want to also make sure that we are doing some checking. So when the user tries to enter a new employee, the user cannot just enter, let's say, blank for first name or title and so forth. So we need some of these fields required. So I'll use required attribute, and I can specify a custom error message if there is a problem with the user input for this particular field. So this is for the ID. So I'll specify the error message to be employee ID is required. I'm gonna copy that and place it on top of the first name as well. And this one is gonna be the employee first name is required. And you guessed it, I'm gonna use it for the last name as well. And let's actually use it for the title. So this is gonna be employee title is required. And the birthday and hire date can be also required. So this is gonna be birth date is required, and this is gonna be that the hire date is required. And the country needs to be required as well, so employee country is required. And the notes can be optional, so we don't need to mark that as required. Next, I'm going to map the employee ID explicitly to the employee ID in my table. When we go to the employee table, you can see the field is called employee ID. So I'm going to explicitly map to it. So I'll specify column. The ID is for the column employee ID. Additionally, I want to make this a key because it is the primary key for the table. And finally, we don't want to enter our own IDs, I'm going to mark this as database generated ID. So the attribute is database generated, and here's the option for the database generated option dot, and it's the identity. So when we enter a new employee, the ID will be automatically generated as an identity field. And finally, since I have this as employee ID as one word, I want to make sure that in our views, we view it as an employee space ID. I want it basically 2 words in the views. So I will mark it as display, and I will specify that the name for the display is going to be the employee space ID. So this is going to be basically a caption next to a text box. Alright, now I'm going to copy some of these and paste them for our other fields as well. So the first name is going to be for the column first name. Again, when we go to our database, you can see we have a first name and we have a last name as well. So this is for column first name. I will also copy the display because I don't want it as one word. I want this to be first space name. And here I also want to limit the string length so the user doesn't enter some really long string for the name. So I'll limit string length, let's say to 20 characters, and if that is not met, I'll specify a custom error message that the first name must be less than 20 characters. Now I'm gonna copy these 3 attributes and paste them right here for my last name as well. So this is gonna be for the column last name, and the display is gonna be last space name, and this one will say that the last name must be, let's say, 30 characters long. So I will do the string length as 30 characters for the last name. Now I'm going to paste that on top of the title as well. So this is for the column title. We can specify the display as well, even though it's one word, so it would actually just display title. But since we already have it for the other columns, I'm gonna specify it here as well. And the title can stay, let's say, 30 characters. So I will specify string length as 30 characters and specify that the title must be less than 30 characters. Now I'm gonna copy the column and display because we don't need the string length for our birth date. So this is for the column birth date. So the name will be birth space date. And that's really all we need. Like I said, we don't specify the string length. And I'm gonna copy these 2 and place them on top of the hire date. So this is for the column hire date. And you know that the display is gonna be hire space date. And that's really all we need, just the column and the display. And I'm gonna copy from the last name the column, display, and string length. And that's gonna be for the country. I'll place it right there. So this is for the column country. The display is going to be country. String length, we can leave it as 30 characters, that's fine. So we can specify that the country must be less than 30 characters. And I'm gonna copy these 3 also for my notes. So this is gonna be for the column notes. We will display notes. And the string length for the notes, let's say 500 characters. So we can say that the notes must be less than 500 characters. And this is our model for employees. So again, we map it to the table employees, and then we map each individual property to its respective table column inside the employee table. And we of course specified few additional attributes such as string length as well as the display for our views. So next, let's create a DB context class so we can start working with our entity framework core.